In this video, I'm just going to touch up on a couple things to look out for and things to your advantage with the Scanline renderer node. If I pop this out, what you could see right now is just the default Scanline renderer settings. And if I zoom in on our render here, just a couple quick things here with some parameters that you could adjust to get some better qualities with the Scanline renderer. So one thing is the anti-aliasing. By default, it's set to none, but if we were to set this to say medium, we could get a little bit better shaping aliasing quality on your render, and we could even take this to high if we wanted to, just to get a little bit more rounding. So if you look at this 1:1 now, that looks a lot smoother than when we had this set to none. So that's one thing we could do. There's also the Z-blend mode, which we could set this to smooth, so we could get a little bit more smoother shaping. In this case, I don't know if it's really given us anything, so we could just set this to none. But that's something sometimes when you see some edgy quality, the Z-blend mode can help fix that. The other option too here is that sometimes we will be using and adjusting is the overscan. So this gives us, currently it just crops our image based on the resolution. So if you have a post camera move, or if you know you're going to need to do you need additional overscan, you could increase this to say 50 or 100, and you could have yourself more overscan. So if I right click and say show overscan, we could see that being rendered out. And again, if we set this to 0, you'll see that we don't have overscan coming out of it. So the overscan is an important one to keep an eye out for sometimes if you're noticing something getting cropped. And then the multi-samples tab, this is where you would increase the samples if you have motion blur for motion blur settings. In this case, since our camera is static and locked off, a sample of 1 is fine. But if this camera was moving, we may want to increase the sample to something higher, like 5, for example. And the next tab is the shader tab. There's a handy opportunity to output some vectors, additional vectors. So by default, if we look at the Scanline render and we look at the layers that are being outputted, we have alpha and we have depth that gets outputted by default, which is great. The other things that we could output out of this thing, in addition to motion, which you would use for vector blurs, is we could output some surface normals and positions. So what we could do is say output vectors, and we could click the surface points and we could scroll down to new, and we could create a position. So we could call this position, and then we'll just give it default RGBA, and we'll hit OK. And then we'll do the same thing for the surface normals. We'll select that and we'll say new, and then we'll create a layer called normals. And same thing here, we'll give it default RGBA. And if we hit OK now, and we view our layers here, you could see we're outputting normals and we are outputting position paths, which the red will represent our X direction, green will represent our Y, and blue will represent our depth in Z. So it's very handy to be able to output these passes from your Scanline renders to use downstream for other needs. But figured I'd point that out in case you weren't aware that you could output surface normals and position passes out of this. So now we could just go back to RGBA and close our Scanline render. And one other thing I just noticed that I made a mistake on when I plugged this basic material in is I plugged this constant in the first input, but we wanted to use this as a diffuse component, so we will plug that in like so. So now we're actually getting this shader as a diffuse component, and we could adjust this material on this thing based on that. And we will look into more of these 3D lights and shaders in the coming videos.